going to be talking about church history, and it's really, I was just trying to find a catchy title, but it's not totally accurate because we're hardly going to talk about Jesus at all. Henry VIII is like not as important to me as a lot of people think he is, and we're going way beyond Henry VIII. So, really hitting the highlights. That's the key here, or we'll never get through it. But there's two big things I want all of you to get out of this, I think. And one is to really get a sense of the spiritual background of the Anglican tradition, and how deep and rich and ancient it really is. And the other is to get a little bit of a sense of what's happened here actually in America and how the Episcopal Church has had its own twist on things with our history. So I hope you'll get that out of this, and we are going to move, and I'm going to move a little bit quickly, but if I'm going too quick, please tell me to stop, just because there is a lot, and I want to make sure we have time to discuss and ask questions. Okay, so here's how I want to start this, though. This is sort of the disclaimer that history is always subjective. It really is, because we are coming to it from our own perspectives. And anybody who writes history has their own perspective, their own bias. And I have my own, and I am very open to tell you I'm going to be giving it to you as we learn tonight. But one of the realizations I made happened in seminaries. If you don't know, I started out in seminary as a priest. But there were other teachings too. There were a lot of problems people had with the Pope and the authority of the Pope. And, it wasn't like the Pope had been, all the popes had been squeaky clean, right? We know that. There had been all kinds of corruption. And people could see the corruption because really the church had gone way off the rails, right? It has just become very corrupt in many ways. I don't know that obviously there was a lot of pressure to always give money to the church, but I'm not sure how, if there was a specific tax involved. I don't remember ever reading that, but you think? The diocese? Yeah, maybe so. Yeah.
So the popes really did have a lot of things they did that was
Right. Yeah, lots of concerns around the popes. But that was a nice way to say it. But there were other theological concerns, deeply theological concerns, like wanting the worship and the scriptures to be in a language people could understand. And there were concerns around how things had gotten way off with the saints, and to the point that it was like worship of the saints instead of just acknowledging these heroes of the faith. And and the role of Mary. And there were like all sorts of issues going on that were at a theological level. But a lot of people, it was just obvious. And many of the clergy at the time were very uneducated. Some of them were completely illiterate. So there were all kinds of concerns. And so as it's kind of like sweeping Europe, and some of the key players, of course, we have John Calvin, who was in Switzerland and Geneva. But in England, Thomas Cranmer is very important, and Richard Hooker is very important. Anybody know what Thomas Cranmer is important for? The Book of Common Prayer. Basically, put it together. And he is a theologian. He is imparting his theology in the worship, in the liturgy itself, in the prayers. And we still use many of Cranmer's prayers today, and the things he did. I mean, you could say he's the most influential because of the Book of Common Prayer. But let me come back to it. Now, the other thing that's going on is, of course, King Henry VIII. He is kind of like we were talking at our table, at the right place at the right time in history. And this was so in the church started by a man who had 6 wives. Forgiveness goes without saying. The Episcopal Church, right. So that was like one of our publicity campaigns. I know. Yeah, so this when I saw this, I pulled my hair out. So I was like, he didn't start the church. But I think they were just trying to be funny. It was part of their humor campaign. But this is actually really poor church history right here. Let me just tell you, right? That is not... I mean, yeah, he had 6 wives, but let me say a little more. So there are political issues going on. There are theological issues going on. It's swirling around Europe. It's swirling around in England. And King Henry, has this problem. He needs an heir, and Catherine of Aragon, of course, is not providing one. He wants an annulment so he can be married to Anne Boleyn. Actually, he's an interesting character because he did struggle with theology, believe it or not. He really did. And he really thought, I wouldn't say this is good theology, but in his theology, he thought that the fact that Catherine of Aragon never produced the male heir was showing him that the marriage was a blight of God. And the reason he thought that is because she had been married to his brother previously. And so, I don't know. I mean, we can't, possibly know what was in his mind. But there were some struggles for him in this. I don't think it was purely like, get rid of this woman, I want somebody else. I mean, I think there were some bigger pieces here. But you have to realize Henry is being advised by many Protestant-motivated clergy and lawyers at the time, people who are ready to take on the full force of the theological changes and renewal and shift in the church. And they're advising Henry at this time. And how convenient is it that the Pope refuses this annulment? Well, Henry, maybe it's time to separate from Rome, right? And you can be head of the church in England. I think it really was convenient. I think it was. I think that people who wanted to see the Reformation happen in the church really utilized that moment in history. And it should also be said that when the Pope refused the annulment, by the way, it wasn't for pure theological reasons either. It was also politically motivated. So everything that was happening, in this controversy was very messy and political, and it wasn't about good morals. Okay, let's just say that. So Henry is advised, you know what? Let's go independent. And Thomas Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, now becomes the authority to give him the annulment, right? To give him the annulment. And, of course, he gets to remarry. And the Pope excommunicates them immediately. But do note that this was not the final severing moment of Church of England and Rome yet. But Henry starts to function essentially in England as head of the church. And when that happens, nothing substantially changes immediately for the average churchgoer. Okay. Yeah. Well, once Rome took over, everybody had to be ordained in apostolic succession. So, by this point, all the English bishops are in apostolic succession. So they've got it now, right? Now, that Rome would still say that they're no longer valid simply because they're no longer part of Rome, right? But from an Anglican perspective, we say, no, once you have it, you always have it. If you're in apostolic succession, you're in apostolic succession. So, yeah. Right, it wasn't. But I'm saying, so Rome has now taken over and been in charge for a few hundred years. So everything has now changed over to the Roman system within that whole region. So, yeah. Yeah, but that was a non-issue. That wasn't much, for the Celtic Church. I shouldn't say non-issue, but it wasn't the issue that it was. Okay, so if you were in England at this time and you're sitting in the pews, there's not this immediate shift like, look, oh my goodness, we just, split from Rome. That wasn't how it was. Things just kind of carried on a little while, and then we start seeing Protestantism, the reforming trends start to creep in. And of course, one of the big things that happens is the Book of Common Prayer is written in English. And this is really transformative because now worship is in English. Can you imagine what that would have been like to go? You go one Sunday, you've been doing this in Latin, and you go, and now you can hear the entire liturgy in English, and you understand everything that's going on. The scriptures, they're working on translating the scriptures into English so that you can understand the Bible. And these are all really important ideas of the Reformation, right? The fact that we don't need somebody else to tell us what the Bible says or what is, what we can read it for ourselves. We can understand it, and we can commune directly with God. We don't have to commune through somebody else, through a priest or someone else, or through the Pope or whatever. You had a hand? Mm-hmm. That went on for a long time. Yes. Laity are given a more vital role in the church in England now. All of those Roman excesses are slowly done away with, right? One of the big ones is clergy are allowed to marry. Woohoo! They get married. But at the same time, theology is developing around it. It isn't just purely reactionary. Richard Hooker, who is, I think, is really the most important theologian, in terms of his writings, writes in his Ecclesiastical Polity, he writes a lot about the importance of understanding this more Protestant theological view of how we connect to each other and to God. And what's interesting is if you read the writings that were happening in the time of the Reformation, you have that more extreme side of things, like the more Puritan or Lutheran, or sort of saying those Roman Catholics are evil and they're all going to hell, right? And the Roman Catholics are doing the same thing, and they're over there going, oh my goodness, all those Protestants are evil and they're all going to hell. And then it's so fascinating because then you get to some of these English Church of England theologians like Richard Hooker, and he says things like, actually, I don't think either of them have to go to hell. I think we might all end up in heaven together. We don't have to agree on everything, right? I mean, paraphrasing, of course. But he describes this middle way, what we call the via media. And England takes on this really interesting role within the Reformation because England is sort of one of the very few places that sort of says, you know what? We can keep the best of all of it. We can keep what is so wonderful and rich about what we've been doing, in this sort of Roman tradition, this ancient, concept of liturgy. But we can also take on this renewed understanding through the Reformation of how we connect to God and our personal relationship with Christ and with others, and how we can relate to the Bible and worship and prayer. And a lot of what Cranmer was trying to do when he wrote the Book of Common Prayer was make it so that you didn't have to be clergy or a monk. That's why we have the daily office. You have morning. You, as a layperson, could just go and read morning prayer with your family, and noon prayer, and evening prayer, just like they were doing in the monasteries. You don't have to be a monk. You can do that at home. So there's this vital role suddenly that people, the average, churchgoer, is suddenly at the center in a way they hadn't been. I can't go through all the ins and outs. We'll run out of time with with all of the wonderful things that happened during this time with the monarchy and things. But of course, it does go back and forth a bit. When Queen Mary, we had Edward, then we had Mary, and of course when she takes the throne, and she's called Bloody Mary, she's eventually a Roman Catholic in persuasion, and she persecutes, and puts to death many of the, quote, heretics at the time, right? One of the things that happens under Mary, of course, is Thomas Cranmer is arrested. And he's arrested for treason. And it's so interesting because the church has never really decided what to do about Cranmer. Is he a martyr or not? And this is why. The reason is that he's arrested for treason, but he recants everything. He becomes a coward, you could say, right before they're going to put him to death. And he signs, the recantation. And then he, I don't know how long goes by, but he suddenly has a change of heart and says, no, wait a minute, I can't do that. That's a lie, right? I have to be true to what I believe. I take back I do not recant. And so they bring him to burn him at the stake. And the story is that he says, he puts his right hand in the fire and says that this burns first because this is my offending hand. And he goes up in flames. And he dies. But, so is he a martyr? I think he kind of is, but anyway. Now, what's happening back on the American continent is something interesting because in 1579, Sir Francis Drake lands in the Bay of San Francisco. And he holds one of the very earliest services, and it's a prayer book service. He uses the Book of Common Prayer for a service, back away. So you think about that. On this part of the continent, all the way back in 1579, here's the prayer book. The Puritans, of course, are starting to flee, various feeling that the English church is not reforming enough. And of course, we know a lot of that story. But in the 1600s, we have Jamestown is established. We have the church, these are Anglicans now coming and establishing a church in Jamestown. Oh, I'm not following my slides. Here's Thomas Cranmer, by the way, holding his Book of Common Prayer. There is a wonderful painting of him putting his hand in the fire, but I didn't put that one up. So there's this other stuff happening. I just pointed out here, but going back to England again, when Queen Elizabeth takes the throne, she is excommunicated by Pope Pius V. And actually, when she's excommunicated, that was the real and true final break of the communion with Rome. The church, it says, has never subsequently dared to define its identity decisively as Protestant or Catholic, and had it decided in the other than a handicap to be both, right? Elizabeth gives the Church of England an important flavor. She really embraces Richard Hooker's idea of the via media. She really sees the Church of England as having that role. That's its gift, its charism, its gift to the world, in a sense. I mean, she has this concept of that. There's the Elizabethan religious settlement that essentially embraces that concept of Protestant and Catholic at the same time. So, in many ways, I think if we hadn't had Elizabeth, had been going kind of back and forth, we really probably wouldn't have Anglicanism in the way we know it today. Because she really gives it that stamp, and her reign was long enough and, influential enough to really give it this flavor. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think she takes the throne at like 1558 or so. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, really influential. Okay, so back to the American continent now, back over here. So we get these Anglicans who arrive, and, so one of the first churches here, the settlers at Jamestown. Now, this isn't the original building because that poor building, was burned and rebuilt like 6 times or something. But this is what is there now. But they come and they begin to function essentially just like Church of England, but on a different continent. They are less successful than a lot of the other Christian groups because, of course, once the Reformation hits and people start moving into independent thought about things, that's when we start seeing the splintering of all of these different denominational groups, right? What do we end up today with all these different denominations? So we have the Quakers, we have the Shakers, we have all these different religious experiences people are having. Things go from the Pilgrims and the Puritans to the Presbyterians, and then eventually you have the Methodists, and you have, the Congregationalists, right? There's just all this religious expression going on, and they're much more innovative than the Anglicans. Anglicans have just never been very good at that. They're sort of like, all right, we build a church, everybody come on in. Whereas, the other groups are going out on horseback and evangelizing to the natives, and, but Anglicans have just never been really good at that. I think because they were used to being the established church, right? We have a church. Why don't you come? Why don't you come in? In 1611, we get the King James Bible, right, in English. But then, so things are kind of plugging along, and then there's this event in 1775. What happens? The Revolutionary War. And guess how popular it was to be an Anglican? Here. This is where our name change comes from. The reason we're called Episcopalians and not Anglicans is because it wasn't popular to be Anglican. Episcopal just means to have bishops. And so the revolution really changes everything for the church in many ways. No, not everything, but it changes a lot of things for people. And of course, there's a very strained relationship now for the American Anglicans, or now called Episcopalians, and the rest of Church of England. And so pretty quickly, we run into trouble with not having enough bishops. And so this becomes a big deal in America because you need a bishop to do all sorts of things, to confirm people, to ordain people, right? And we had none at this time. We had none. Everybody had to keep going back to England to get consecrated.
Every American parish is under the jurisdiction of
Okay, yeah. Right. Well, that's interesting, yeah. Yeah, and it wasn't easy like it is today to get over to England either. So, everybody in the colonies is what do we do? What do we do? We need to get a bishop here because the church is really stunted. We can kind of grow without a bishop. And so they elect Samuel Seabury in Connecticut. The people in Connecticut elect him to be their bishop, and he sails all the way to England. And what sort of warm invitation did he have when he got there? You can go right back home. Bye-bye. We're not ordaining you a bishop. And so Samuel Seabury realizes, there's bishops over in Scotland. Why don't I go there? And he does. So Samuel Seabury goes up to Scotland in 1784, and the bishops in Scotland, I think it's tradition you have to have 3 bishops. Is that what it is? 3 bishops to consecrate another bishop, new bishop. Goes to Scotland, and so we have this debt of gratitude to the Scottish church. Yeah. At that point, there were Anglican bishops in Scotland at that point. Yeah. So that saved us. Okay, so he goes, yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thank you. I'm sure you can fill in some of this fun stuff. This is great. All right. Where am I in my notes? There's so much. Okay. I got to hurry up. Here is the Episcopal Church seal. Yes. So what do you notice about it? Yeah. St. Andrew's cross is in there to commemorate or sort of symbolize our connection to Scotland. St. Andrew's cross, and then St. George, we said, yeah. So, a lot of people don't realize that. That's what our seal comes from. I lost my place. I have all these notes. Okay. Once we have Samuel Seabury, of course, and we start realizing we can get bishops through Scotland, we get more bishops, and we begin to organize here in America. We start to have enough clergy and bishops that we can start having our own conventions. And of course, this is all happening when the country is also developing a sense of its own government here in America. So it's very democratic in the process. And so our process today, if you look at our polity as a church, looks a lot like our current U.S. government, because they were developing at the same time in the same ways. And they sort of felt like we learned our lesson back in England. We're going to do this more democratically now, even in the church, right? And they established the role of the presiding bishop, we call them, who kind of is more of a figurehead. There isn't a lot of authority there, but we would say power of persuasion maybe in that role. And in 1804, this is the other thing that's so fascinating. The Episcopal Church in America really was enabled in a way because of this independence to do a lot of firsts, shall we say, to be the first to do a lot of really groundbreaking things in a social sense. The Episcopal Church ordained the very first black priest in 1804. The Roman Catholics didn't ordain a black priest until 1886. So about 82 years later, Absalom Jones is ordained. In 1827, the Oxford movement, again, we could do a whole class on that, but let's just, enough to say that this makes a big dent in our liturgical style. There's an emphasis on a more Anglo-Catholic, going back to a more ancient flavor of things. You see the Eucharist being held up as a more important role. Churches start to define themselves as a high church or low church or broad church. You see these different liturgical influences in the church. But the important thing is ultimately we do end up maintaining our Anglican identity and role here in America. And the way we define that is by saying that we're in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at the moment is the Most Reverend Justin Welby. And so if you are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, that ties you to the Anglican communion as a whole, right? And the Anglican communion, I believe, is the third largest Christian body in the world, right? Yeah. I didn't double check it, but I'm pretty sure that's right. The Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't function like the Pope, though. We'll never do that. That'll just never happen. Again, it's much more a symbol of unity. The Archbishop is a symbol of unity, and definitely calls leaders together to make big decisions, to discuss important issues and things like at the Lambeth Conference and things, but does not have authority. I mean, Justin Welby can't come over here and say to us, you guys, change, that's not going to happen. He probably wants to. Censored, sort of. Well, they were disinvited, shall we say, from some of these gatherings to sort of, and that's about the extent that can be done, because because some of the decisions we made were not. No, it's still going on. Mm-hmm. From some of the Anglican worldwide gatherings that happen, the Episcopal Church and our leaders have not been invited to those because we've been doing our own thing too much. So, in a way, is that going to change us? It sure hasn't yet. I think Michael Curry, our presiding bishop right now, was like, all right, kind of like they're lost. I mean, there was no big kerfuffle about it. It was, okay. I love the fact that in 1893, I don't have slides for this, but in 1893, Congress actually grants a national house of prayer we call it the National Cathedral, right, in Washington, D.C. And it's where our nation often holds many of its important religious and national ceremonies. But I thought if anything betrays our heritage as Anglicans, having a national cathedral sure does. Because there's really no such thing. I mean, we really aren't the national church, but it's sort of like we're acting like we are or something. You know what I mean? Okay, I think that's funny.
And they chose the church that they rebelled from. From the church of the country that we rebelled from.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. All these Anglophiles, Some of the other firsts. In 1944, the very first female priest is ordained. 1944, did you hear me?
Yeah,
This is Florence Tim Oy. She was in China during the Japanese invasion, and it was necessary, and she was the only one, so we ordained her. In 1974, here in America, there was the Philadelphia 11. Those are the very first women, so we ordain women. And there was huge controversy because their ordination was irregular because it didn't get the consent of General Convention. Okay, we had this democratic process, and General Convention was not going to be in a position to vote yes for women's ordination yet. So bishops got together and said, well, we're just going to do it anyway. And they ordained 11 women to the priesthood. And it didn't take long because just 2 years later, General Convention then votes to allow women to be ordained in 1976. And when they take the vote, they decide to take it all the way. They say women can be ordained to the priesthood and to the episcopate to become bishops. It takes England till, 1992 before women could be bishops. right? Or no, 1992 before they ordained women as priests. And then they've only started ordaining women as bishops recently. Yeah. In 1992, something important happens. The vicar of Dibley comes on the air, but sort of looking at this plight of what it was like to be a woman, priest in the church at that time. So many challenges. I think that some challenges are still there, but in 2003, the Episcopal Church opens the first openly gay bishop, right? Gene Robinson of New Hampshire. And in 2006, the Episcopal Church elects the very first female primate, which is a presiding bishop. So we have all these incredible firsts. And I just like to think it's the Holy Spirit is just moving us along, and that we're open to it. That's what I think. Something else, this is just fun. I just love this. And anybody know this story? What happened with the Communion on the Moon story? So on July 20th of 1969, there's an important event. We land on the moon. And Buzz Aldrin took communion that had been consecrated by an Episcopal priest. And NASA hid it. They didn't want anybody to know this. It was quiet. But he took it, and they celebrated. The very first food and drink on the moon was Holy Communion. Isn't that great? And the Episcopal Church has made that a feast day now, July 20th, to commemorate that. And we call it communion, the first communion on the moon or something like that. But that's the chalice that Buzz Aldrin used for communion because he was like a lay Eucharistic visitor, essentially, for his church. And so he was allowed to do that. So he shared. I just think that's fun. Okay. So this is how I want to kind of wrap it up. The Anglican tradition is so rich, and again, this is such a quick overview of some of the highlights, but I hope it helps. But I love to show this because if you look at this list of people, some of the more famous Anglicans, you see how incredibly diverse a group of people Episcopalians are. More than a quarter of all U.S. presidents have been Episcopalians. There are, I do have the statistics here. There are Anglicans in every nation, 80 million, and it is the third largest Christian body in the world. The Episcopal Church has just around, numbers have been going down, but 2 million members. It's the 14th largest denomination in the U.S. So we just never really caught on from those pioneering days. We've just never been the pioneering type. I don't think we ever will be. We still love to set up a beautiful church and do our liturgy and have our beautiful music and just kind of be like, all right, everybody come. and I think that is a big part of our evangelism, but we can do more than that. But isn't this a fun list? Can you see it? Yeah. Oh, I know. So I was researching. I've added to this list over the years, Oh, really? Betty Grable? Yeah. This is not exhaustive, obviously. But but the Batman story there is funny because I was researching famous Episcopalians at some point, and Batman came up. And it's actually a huge, if you're a Batman fan, it's a huge controversy of whether he's Episcopalian or is it Methodist, I think. Because, his dad was one, if you go back into his history, his dad was Episcopalian or something, and his mother was Methodist. But, there's a whole group of people that are rallying for Batman's Episcopalian. So I thought I would put it up there. Why not? I'll take Batman, because we'll take anybody. We don't, we just want to open the doors and bring people in to meet Jesus. I know. Anglican. No, I'm saying Anglican. And, there has been a movement in the Episcopal Church to start identifying ourselves more as Anglicans, especially as we've had more of an international, presence and people coming. What I discovered in campus ministry was that the people coming from Africa or Asia, to the campus, were literally looking in a phone book or online for Anglicans and not finding us. Because we were all listed under Episcopalian. Yeah, so there's some groups that have broken off of the Episcopal Church that have taken the name Anglican. So, but they're not in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, so but what can you say? But we decided in campus ministry we had to start using the name Anglican more for all these international students to find us, because they didn't know what's an Episcopalian. And actually, people still don't know what Episcopalians are. I had a booth. This was when I was working at University of Michigan. I had a big booth, and I was like, the Episcopal, I can't remember what it said. Something about we welcome you in the Episcopal campus ministry. Something like that. And this college student was like very astute, and he looks at it, and he looks at me, and he goes, so what is an episcopal? Sounded very medical. So, anyway, any questions, any other thoughts? I know I'm probably way out of time, so I want to have time for discussion. But this was very quick highlight of things. Kind of bring us to where we are now. Anything? You may just be more confused right now than before we started, so I'm sorry if that's true. But my hope is that as we go through the series, we will be able to pull some of these things out. So for instance, when Mark talks about Anglican theology, we're going to get to dig in a lot more into like Richard Hooker and some of Thomas Cranmer, and then of course when we talk about worship, we'll talk about that too. So stuff will come up and make more sense as we continue the series.